Hi everyone. In this particular presentation, we're going to be having a look at the future of supply chains, typically up to 20 years out. I'm your host. My name is Matthew Griffin. I'm the CEO and founder of the 311 Institute, a futures and deep futures think tank working up to 50 years out. Now, I work with all G20 governments, and normally you can find me on the flip side of this equation, working with some of the world's most respected brands to help them see the future and develop the products of the future, which we then start shipping around the world in these various supply chains that we're going to be talking about. Now, in this particular presentation, I'm going to be going through a few things. Typically, we're going to be looking at technologies and trends, but we're going to be having a look at lots and lots of things that either directly influence the supply chain or indirectly influence the supply chains that we care about. So we're going to have a little bit of an introduction. We're going to have a look at the supply chain industry, basically from what I call the high tower. We're going to have a quick conversation about China. So I'm going to show you some things that you didn't necessarily know about China when it comes to supply chains. We're going to have a look at the future of supply chains themselves, because obviously that's the presentation. We're also going to be having a look at what I call EEPS trends, so economic, environmental, political, and societal trends, because a lot of the technology trends I'll have actually covered in previous sections. And then I'm going to show you what you end up having to do next in order to prepare for an increasingly what we call sort of VUCA world. Now, when we have a look at the number of trends and technologies that either directly or indirectly influence supply chains, as well as the products that we buy, why we buy them, how we buy them, who we buy them from, and so on and so forth. There are hundreds of trends and there are hundreds of different technologies. Now, in these particular codexes, which you can download just by clicking the QR code or scanning the QR code, in the Trends Codex, there are over 230 megatrends, and in the Technology Codex, I detail over 300 exponential emerging technologies. And you can dig into all of these at your leisure, but I'm going to be covering off the main ones in this presentation. Now, just to kind of get a scope, basically, and a feel for the different sets of information that we're trying to identify and bring together to try to figure out what future supply chains could look like, should look like, and will look like. Yeah, there is a staggering number of data points, and that's unsurprising. So just to kind of try to bring this to life for you, I've put the Trends Codex into a 1-minute video, because these are the trends inevitably that we're trying to get our heads around to figure out what future supply chains might look like. So how's your pause game? That was over 230 megatrends where climate change was up there for about 1/4 of a second, net zero for 1/4 of a second, ESG for 1/4 of a second, and so on and so forth. So you can see the challenge that we're actually trying to sort of get our heads around. Now, in addition to that, basically, we're also living in a world full of increasingly science fiction-like technologies. So when we have a look at supply chains, for example, this is my Griffin Emerging Technology Starburst. I publish these every year. There are over 170 exponential technologies across 13 categories listed on this particular starburst. When we have a look at advanced manufacturing, technologies like 3D printing and 4D printing, as well as molecular assemblers, which Toyota have actually been using to make their next generation lithium-ion batteries, have an impact on the $10 trillion manufacturing industry. And so obviously, those three technologies alone, particularly 3D printing at the moment, will have an increasingly oversized impact basically on what future supply chains will look like, could look like, and so on and so forth. Now, when we have a look at things like biotech, increasingly biotech will actually play a greater role in building particular products. For example, gene-edited bacteria, we're already seeing China creating photovoltaic panels that are 50% more energy efficient than anything else that we have on the market. That's it. So even these kinds of sort of rather weird general purpose technologies like gene editing can actually influence the goods that we produce and where we buy them from, as well as cost structures and the economics of particular industries. When we have a look at compute, basically we are moving basically from silicon-based computing to quantum-based computing to neuromorphic-based computing to biological-based computing and so on and so forth. When we have a look at networks, we're moving from 4G to 5G, we're moving then to 6G, but we're also moving to a world where everyone on the planet is connected via low Earth orbit satellites. Now, when we start having a look at how we track supply chains, for example, increasingly we are tracking the progress of individual ships, products, etc., using LEO-based satellites. But again, when we have a look at materials, we have new materials. When we have a look at robotics, the advent of robotics brings with it the advent of fully autonomous dark warehouses, which has a oversized impact on, for example, the logistics chains, autonomous ports. When we have a look at intelligence, we have artificial narrow intelligence today, moving to artificial general intelligence around 2035. And then we keep going around and around and around. But overall, depending on the products that we're actually developing, depending on the sector that you're actually interested in, these technologies are transforming everything. Even when we have a look at energy, we're in the middle of a $92 trillion shift from fossil fuels to renewables. Now, when we actually have a look at the amount of what we call merchandise trade, so every year we're shipping about $20 trillion of merchandise trade around the world, of which fuel is about $4 trillion. All of a sudden, if we are changing the energy sources that the world runs on, that $4 trillion energy supply chain changes. When we have a look at digital trade or services trade, annually we are now starting to see trade volumes in the services space of about $6 trillion, which is up from about $4.1 trillion in 2011. So while when we have a look at merchandise trade, it's the annual flows are a little bit lumpy, when we have a look at services trade, that's actually growing at quite an interestingly consistent rate, even during COVID. But all of these different technologies change what we buy, who we buy it from, and so on and so forth. Now, when we have a look at the world that we're living in, we all know that we live in a VUCA world. Volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. But increasingly, I think that we're living in this world, VUCA Max, where the changes are increasingly massive. I'll go through a couple of those. The changes are increasingly accelerating, and everything is increasingly exponential. Now, when we have a look at things from the high tower, by 2027, it's estimated that we're going to be transacting $111 trillion across our different sort of various ERP and business-to-business payment systems. Now, this includes global trade. Now, this is mostly SMB, that's it. So in fact, around 65 to 70% of it is estimated to be SMB. So when we're having a look at the future of supply chains, SMBs are still going to be playing a significant role in a lot of these supply chains. By the year 2050, 85% of global GDP will come from 32 countries. Now, what this means is that your supply chains are generally going to be geared and optimized towards 32 countries, less the rest. But by 2050, global GDP is estimated to double, and it's no surprise that around 40% of all global GDP will be related to China, India, and the US, with the rest following up. Now, when we have a look at procurement, particularly sort of ESG ratings, 97%, according to Gartner, 97% of senior executives prioritize sustainable procurement and sustainable business practices. However, only 69% of CPOs actually prioritize sustainable procurement, and only 69% of CPOs actually have decent sustainability and ESG ratings on a lot of their suppliers. So there's a gap of about a third here. Now, this becomes important later on. Now, when we talk about supply chains, are we talking really about supply chains, or are we talking about what the future of value chains looks like? Because as the value chains move, our supply chains move. The people we buy products from, the countries that we work with inevitably change as well. So when we have a look at global value chains are moving across the board, irrespective of what sector you actually work in or represent. So for example, in Dubai, we are now starting to put the MOUs together to 3D print an 11-story skyscraper. Now, from a construction perspective, that means basically that we no longer necessarily buy concrete from Aditya Birla in India. Maybe we are buying lavacrete that is produced locally from the sand around Abu Dhabi, maybe in the UAE, or even KSA. When we have a look at the energy shift, I talked earlier about the transition to renewable energy being a $92 trillion transition. Over $4 trillion of merchandise trade is energy related. Gas, oil, that kind of stuff. Now, as the world moves further and further away from a fossil fuel-based economy, those supply chains move, those value chains move, because maybe we start deprioritizing Russia and perhaps the Middle East, or even the UK, Norway, and North America or Latin America, depending where we're getting our oil from, for example. And maybe we start prioritizing Australia, that is increasingly able to export solar power via the global undersea HVDC electrical networks. When we have a look at finance, everything's changing here. We're moving from banking to fintechs to decentralized finance. Increasingly, the money that we pay with is changing. The payments themselves are changing as well. So what we pay with and how we pay for all of these different goods and these different suppliers is changing. When we have a look at manufacturing, increasingly more and more manufacturers are starting to embrace 3D printing. Now, 3D printing is still a nascent technology. It's still scaling, but I'll have some examples of this later. But when we actually have a look at things like Industry 4, with digital twin technologies, continuous innovation technologies, again, the partners basically that we start playing with and buying from changes. And then when we actually have a look at transportation itself, which then brings in logistics, the only thing that's happening with the global logistics industry is it's increasingly automated. So we're seeing autonomous ports in China. We're seeing increased use of semi and fully autonomous cargo ships around the world. The fuels basically that the logistics vehicles actually run on is changing as well, whether it's electric, hydrogen, ammonia, whether it's sustainable aviation fuels and so on and so forth. But then increasingly, a lot of the global logistics companies like DP World, for example, are now starting to prioritize different kinds of multimodal logistics chains. Because if you have a look at DP World are now starting to invest much more heavily in areas that are supplied by barges, because barges can move goods at around 60 sort of times less carbon dioxide emissions than aviation or traditional shipping. So we're starting to see all these different changes coming through. Now, when we have a look at China, China is doing this. China is trying to own global value chains. Now, the reason for this is because if you own a global value chain, then it's very difficult for people to sanction you. In fact, it's then easier for you to actually exert your soft power on other people. but also you own a bigger part of the pie. You boost your GDP, you boost jobs and growth and everything else on the world stage. So China are trying to own and dominate global value chains. Now, they're doing this in a couple of ways. So firstly, they have a 1.4 trillion CCP package that they put in place a few years ago. Now, this 1.4 trillion package is designed to allow China to invest in the development of emerging technologies, so such as UHVDC electrical systems, so energy, quantum computers, artificial intelligence, genetic engineering and editing, 5G, 6G networks, and so on and so forth. Now, in addition to that, we're also seeing China actually invest very, very heavily in a program called the Little Giants program. So we're all very familiar basically with organizations like Huawei, ZTE, Alibaba, Baidu, Tencent, and everything else. The big Chinese tech giants, or just giants. However, China is staunchly investing in trying to make little giants a success. So little giants are organizations that are turning over typically between 10 million and about $500 million in revenue. They're not really designed to be giant companies that rival the big tech giants, these multi-billion-dollar revenue organizations. But what they're doing is they're burrowing into all the different supply chains. So for example, you might end up with a little giant that is a specialist in one kind of robotics. And if you want to buy that kind of robotics technology, then the only option is to embrace China, and so on and so forth. So little giants, basically, there are about 14,000 little giants now, are designed to be almost indispensable when it comes to you making your purchasing decision on what to buy, who to buy it from, and so on and so forth. Now, in addition to that, basically, when we have a look at both of these programs, they're both dedicated CCP, so Chinese Communist Party programs, and they are led by the highest levels. In addition to that, China's government has recently been taking what we call golden shares, so which is a typical sort of 1% of the shares of individual companies. Now, the reason for this is because, again, the CCP are then able to have a vote on the board of those companies, but they're then also able to steer the direction that those companies move in, so the overall strategy. So golden shares is one way that the Chinese government is able to exert direct influence and control basically over companies that they see as being either a threat to the national interest or critical to the national interest, or both. So recently, organizations like Alibaba and Tencent basically have now had to give up golden shares. But when we start taking a look at purchasing decisions, if you are starting to buy goods from a company where the decisions can be influenced by the Chinese CCP, as someone said in Paris the other day, do you buy from them? So, these are all kind of decisions that we actually have to make. And then this $1.4 trillion package, basically, which was laid out a couple of years ago, is designed to promote key technologies. That's it. And we're also starting to see things like technology standards bifurcation and so on and so forth. Now, when we have a look at the future of supply chains themselves, some of these won't be a surprise to you, obviously. But increasingly, as we start having a look at the future of supply chains, there are many more organizations that talk about the ability to set and forget. So these are typically digitized, smart, and autonomous supply chains. Note autonomous, not automated, that have centrally set KPIs, which then means basically that these automated and or autonomous supply chains, on the one hand, using artificial intelligence, can predict basically that you need a particular product. They can then decide, these systems can then decide to buy that particular product and then use the metrics that you've put into your KPIs to determine where it's going to buy it from. So for example, a KPI that we could use basically would be buy X from the highest rated ESG supplier using the most energy efficient payment method. And the system will automatically analyze all of the different suppliers, calculate which ones are best according to those KPIs, and then go and place the orders. Now, when we have a look at supply chains, increasingly we talk in terms of digital twins. So We then move to meta twins, which are increasingly virtual reality-based supply chains, and we're seeing that especially in the industrial sector. But then we also have twins that you can talk to. So once you've digitized your supply chain, if you put a natural language interface over the top of it, all of a sudden you can now start having a conversation with it. So as opposed to interacting with your supply chain via your traditional ERP platform, you can now start talking to it and understanding in natural language, a little bit like we do with ChatGPT, kind of, what's going on. So imagine being able to query your entire global supply chain just by talking to it. Supply chains are increasingly being run on distributed ledger technologies, basically like blockchain, but we're also starting to see some organizations moving to embrace what we call quantum-proof blockchains, which ironically, basically are predominantly being developed in Russia. So when we have a look at blockchain technology, blockchain technology is especially good at helping automate customs handoffs, helping digitize basically the supply chain, but also providing real-time auditing, compliance, and monitoring capabilities. And as well, a big one, helping with transparency. So inevitably, if we want to recall something because it's faulty, again, using blockchain technology, we can very quickly understand where those products came from and put appropriate policies and procedures in place. But we can also very quickly understand what batches were affected, where those batches went, and pull them off the shelves. Now, in Walmart's case, a traditional recall, for example, of pork, will generally cost them about $1.5 million per recall. So blockchain actually helps with recalls, as well as lots of other things. Inevitably, once we digitize supply chains, we're going to be applying machine learning, data science, and all kinds of other things to it. So this is where today we are heavily embedding artificial intelligence, and in the future, artificial general intelligence into supply chains. And I won't go through this entire list, but obviously, once we start applying artificial intelligence to different parts of our supply chains, we can analyze basically the patterns that we can analyze patterns faster. We can automate those supply chains. Decision making and forecasting becomes much more straightforward, especially if we start talking to our supply chains. Inventory planning and tracking. Risk modeling is probably one of the biggest benefits that I see that we don't talk too much about, because once you digitize a supply chain and embed artificial intelligence, all of a sudden, it's much, much easier and cheaper for you to model the risks in different parts of your supply chain. Now, historically, if you wanted to understand the particular risk that a supplier posed to you, say, for example, you wanted to see what would happen if their factory shut down or they went out of business or whatever it happened to be, traditionally, running these kind of modeling or scenario exercises would take you a very long time. But now with artificial intelligence, we can run multiple scenarios a day, an hour, let alone basically a week. And that now means basically that we can actually get a much deeper understanding of the risks associated with different elements and parts of our supply chain. And then, of course, artificial intelligence, as it starts improving, can increasingly self-optimize your supply chains as well, based on the patterns that it's seeing and so on and so forth. When we have a look at quantum technologies, we have organizations like BMW who are increasingly using quantum computers to run highly sophisticated matrix and optimization algorithms that, in BMW's case, bearing in mind they have a massive global supply chain because each BMW car is made up of about 30,000 different components, means that all of a sudden, if you have a quantum computing based digital supply chain, easy for me to say, you can run real-time optimization. But these supply chains are also able to reconfigure themselves almost in real time. So imagine basically something happening to one particular supplier, an event that would normally disrupt the flow of goods to you. And imagine basically a supply chain that as soon as it sees a particular event taking place, understands what the impact of those events actually happen to be, and then just reconfigures the supply chain to go around that supplier, find a new supplier, whatever it happens to be, so you don't have any disruption to the continuity of supply. Plus, quantum supply chains are also inherently secure because of the principles of quantum mechanics. We also have virtual technologies increasingly being used and virtual inspections. Increasingly, we're able to use communications technologies, basically like 5G and low Earth orbit satellites, and combine those with different immersive technologies to do a very kind of different factory audit or factory survey. When we have a look at virtual trials, organizations in the food space can actually now use a combination of Japanese technology, which allows you to taste new foods and smell new foods virtually. So you could be Unilever based in New York. A supplier over in Tokyo could say, well, we've got a brand new kind of food and we'd actually like you to buy it, but you normally need to fly a team over there to try it and sort of actually have chats about it. Now we can actually try virtual food from across the other side of the planet. So there's lots of sort of different odd things that are happening. And then when we again have a look at DP World along with Virgin, we have this concept of the cargo loop. Now, cargo loop, when we have a look at DP World are generally investing in building out the very earliest Hyperloop technologies, essentially in India. Because while Hyperloop is a multi-decade project in itself, so Hyperloops are essentially trains in a vacuum that are able to move at about Mach 1, so typically 600, 700 miles an hour. China has their own, which is a T-flight, which is capable, or will be capable, as they say, of transporting goods at about 2,500 miles per hour. When we start having a look at Hyperloops, once the networks are built, provided they're built, because it's highly capital intensive, will be able to move goods from the port of Shanghai, so these are containers, from the ports of Shanghai all the way through the Middle East and up to Rotterdam and The Hague and so on and so forth. The cost of trucking and then at the speed of air freight. So imagine being able to move containers from one side of the planet to the other in about 12 hours. Bearing in mind that the typical cargo ship journey at the moment is about 28 days. Now, you wouldn't use this for all of the products you're buying, you might use it for some. And then when we actually have a look at what Elon Musk is trying to do, we actually have the US military that is trying to move people and goods from one side of the planet to the other in 45 minutes using rockets. But unless you're really in a hurry for your products, you might not actually want to be using that technology. We've got growing threats. So when we actually digitize supply chains, when we increase the number of partners that we're actually talking with and communicating with and doing business with, increasingly we have growing cyber threats. Now, one of the trends that we're seeing in cyber crime is we used to hold you to ransom. So ransomware, we'd sort of try to either steal information, encrypt that information, and then sort of charge you to release it. But what we're seeing is we're now starting to see more organized crime groups specifically targeting suppliers. And in this case, we've actually seen one of SpaceX's suppliers being targeted and hacked into. And in that case, basically the crooks are saying, we now have your latest rocket designs, SpaceX, because we managed to lift them from one of your suppliers. So supply chain attacks. Now, either give us a load of money or we're going to give these designs to people that you don't want to have them. So extortion is actually a growing trend that we see when we talk about supply chain security. Smart contract vulnerabilities, we've seen lots and lots of examples now of where hackers have simply tweaked the code of a smart contract so that when you get your goods, normally your blockchain-based smart contract would automatically pay the supplier. But now that money is being routed to a criminal organization and you never get it back. We have the need for zero trust within supply chains. If you aren't operating a zero trust supply chain, then you need to be doing this now. Supply chains are also becoming increasingly dislocated. Now, this is kind of the result, basically, of a lot of the trade wars that we've actually seen, because the trade wars between the US and China disrupted global trade. So now basically we see a lot more companies, particularly the larger organizations with complex supply chains, embracing this trend called friend shoring. So maybe, for example, if we have a look at Apple, maybe we don't make as many products in China any longer because we're not too sure what China's up to. Maybe we now start making more products in India, which is why companies like Foxconn are increasingly expanding operations out of China, both to India, Asia, basically, as well as to North America. So as supply chains become increasingly dislocated, as we start switching from buying from that country to buying from this country because of whatever economic, political, cultural reasons, this is an upticking trend. We're also seeing the rise of nationalism. So for example, if we look within Europe, increasingly Europe is trying to build a competitive semiconductor industry so that we can source computer chips from within Europe rather than having to go to America or China or Taiwan or South Asia and so on and so forth. So we're seeing nationalism, the buy it from your own country if you can, increasingly becoming a dominant trend. And then diversification. When we have a look at most supply chains aren't diversified. In fact, when we actually have a look at supply chain resilience, it's estimated by companies like DHL that only about 15% of supply chains are resilient to shocks, which then means basically that we have 85% of supply chains aren't resilient to shocks because you've optimized your supply chain about buying that particular thing from that particular supplier at that particular price. So in an increasingly VUCA max world, we need not only to ramp up local sourcing, bearing in mind we've also seen massive price inflation, security problems around food, energy, and so on and so forth. So we need to ramp up local sourcing, but then we also need to ramp up multi-sourcing so that if one supplier becomes too big, fails, if there's a trade war or whatever it happens to be, we can flip from buying from them to buying from them. And then we have flattening supply chains, because maybe the best supply chain of all is the supply chain that you don't need because you can simply 3D print whatever products you need on demand wherever you need them, so in situ. Now, when we have a look at Germany, we have an organization called Hyperganic. So Hyperganic used an artificial intelligence to design this particular rocket engine that you see here. But unlike most conventional rocket engines, this rocket engine is made out of a single piece of metal that is 3D printed in Germany. Eliminates the supply chain. When we have a look at Under Armour and Adidas, both these organizations again have used artificial intelligence to reduce the number of components and parts that they need to use to assemble a product with, hence the term flattening supply chains. But then this is the Under Armour Architect sneaker, are 3D printed. Now in Adidas's case, you can either make 100 million trainers in China, ship them all over the world, sell 40 million and send 60 million to the shredder because you didn't manage to sell them, manage all of that inventory and all the pain that goes along with it, or you can simply invite your consumers and your customers to go into an Adidas store, design the shoes that they want, and then print those off in the back. And that's exactly what companies like Under Armour, Adidas, and Nike are now doing. So flattening supply chains. And then when we have a look at Amazon, Amazon now has artificial intelligences that are designing new clothes styles and new fabrics. Now, in this particular case, that means basically that Amazon, who has over 1 billion SKUs, when we have a look at the fabric space, whether it's clothing or home furnishing and everything else, increasingly they have an artificial intelligence that designs the product, puts it onto the website. If you like that product, you buy it, except for that fact that that product doesn't exist until you buy it. Once you buy it, we have automated manufacturing robots and machines and systems which Amazon patented a couple of years ago now that make that shirt once it's been bought. So from Amazon's perspective, all they need is the fabric. They no longer need to hold 13 billion different types of shirts in different sizes in stock. Same goes basically with their partners and their other merchants. So when we have a look at how we use technology to flatten supply chains, there's a lot that's happening there. But it requires a different approach to how you develop and innovate your products in the first place. Now, when we have a look at the technology industry, because from BuyIn's perspective, we are talking much more about technology purchasing, professional services, procurement, and so on and so forth. We've got Google that is working with Seagate and Western Digital to create 7-inch hard drives. So this is how we flatten the supply chain again, just in a different way, because most hard drives are 3.5-inch formats. But the only reason they're in 3.5-inch formats is because floppy drives used to be 3.5 inches wide, and we don't use floppy drives any longer. So now, if you run a hyperscale data center, why not have hard drives that are a fundamentally different format? So this is where we look at things like the open computing and open storage initiatives from companies like Meta, Dell, as well as Google and others. When we have a look at network configurations, when we have a look at the US military, we now have artificial intelligences, not humans, that are auto-configuring networks for them. And then when we have a look at coding, rather than actually getting a DevOps to translate COBOL into Java or C++, we have platforms like IBM Watson, but also Transcoder from Meta, which are essentially universal artificial intelligence translators. But rather than translating English to Spanish, for example, they're translating one kind of program language to another. So when we talk about technology-related or technology industry-related purchasing or system integrator-related technology purchasing, we can still flatten supply chains, but the technologies that we kind of care about here that help us do that are very different to the kinds of technologies that Adidas might care about, and so on and so forth. And then when we have a look at continuous innovation, increasingly we're seeing artificial intelligences design products. They then push the renders and those designs to a fully autonomous digital Industry 4 twin, like the ones that we see with Siemens. And so now what we have is an AI designs the product. It pushes that design to a factory digital twin. That factory digital twin then runs how to make that product in simulation and then optimizes it. So it says if we want to make this product, this is the factory setup that we would need to make it. Now, because the AIs have designed the products, they know what components to use. We can dovetail all of this information straight into our supply chain system that says if you want to make that product, then you need these suppliers, these are the costs, this is the bill of materials that you need, these are the landed costs, and this is how much you could sell the product for. So now all of a sudden what we're doing is we're kind of starting to connect what we call operational technology, the front of the house, because continuous innovation really sings when we start using 5G and Internet of Things technologies to gather data from existing products to design better products with the ICT stack at the center of the house. So there's all kinds of different things coming through that will affect what our supply chains look like, what products basically we are making, how we're making them, who we're sourcing from, etc. And then when we have a look at economic trends as it relates to supply chains, we have both the Chinese and Europe that are now heavily investing in their own Belt and Road initiatives. So China announced quite a number of years ago that they were investing over $1 trillion in Belt and Road initiatives, which is really where they try to create the future logistics highways, basically where we move all these different goods about. So this is investment in ports development, road development, rail development, infrastructure development, and everything else. And because Europe didn't quite like basically what China was doing with its Belt and Road Initiative and how it was kind of behaving, Europe got together and started putting its own money up and creating a competitive program. So when we have a look at the rise of politics, even things like the Belt and Road programs are politicized, rightly or wrongly. When we have a look at the circular economy, the way that we design products increasingly matters. Now, when our R&D teams design and develop products where waste is an unacceptable byproduct, the products that we develop change. Now, BMW, for example, has made the iCircular car, which they want in production by 2030. The whole thing is designed to be reusable and recyclable, but most of the car is glued together. Even the badges are laser etched onto the vehicle. So when we have a look at the circular economy, which again brings us back to sustainable procurement and ESG, we have to start with how we develop these products in the first place. And then at a global level, today, the world generates over 2.1 billion tons of hard waste, trash. By 2050, it's estimated this figure will be 3.4 billion tons. And we've seen what 20,000 tons of rubbish looks like when the garbage workers, basically in Paris, go on strike. It's not pretty. We've got soaring energy and price inflation. Gas prices increased by 244% at the tail end of last year, which again means that if you're Volkswagen had to shut down some of their factories because they just couldn't afford to run them. But when we actually have a look at some of the other associated energy troubles that we're actually having, we have increasing energy scarcity because of climate change. Now in China, for example, in Shanghai, some of the hydroelectric dams started running so low that the Chinese government ended up telling electric vehicle owners they couldn't charge their vehicles because the electricity that was being generated from the hydroelectric dams ended up having to be diverted to keep the factory lights on. We're also seeing that same situation over in California. So when we actually have a look at overall energy and price inflation, we obviously have wars, we're coming off the back of pandemic. Supply chain issues are a major headache, basically, when we talk about price inflation. And in fact, basically, some of the people I talk to over at Maersk and Hapag-Lloyd estimate that really we're not going to get back into a normal supply chain situation until about 2024. And then from an inflation perspective, the economists that I talk to, again, believe really we're looking at kind of Q3, Q4 2023 before we start seeing global inflation, which at the moment is kind of at a historic high of about 8.8%, starting to fall back down to the levels that we'd expect it to be. So normally global inflation will run at about 3.4% on average across the past 10 years, and we're still running at between 6 and 8. But there are some economies like Ghana, like Argentina, whose inflation figures are running way above 50%. Now, when we have a look at ESG, I work with a lot of investors around the world, so organizations like UBS, Citi, BlackRock, you name it, Legal and General, and so on and so forth. And they generally have about $50 trillion under asset. Quite a lot of these organizations are starting to prioritize investment in organizations who are able to demonstrate that they have sustainable business practices. So they're able to demonstrate that they take ESG seriously. Now in the US, basically, we're starting to see ESG investing becoming politicized. So we're starting to see investors like Vantage now coming out of ESG investing and moving into other things. But if you remember earlier, basically I said 97% of CEOs believe that sustainability is a top priority. This is why sustainable procurement needs to close that 30% gap that we saw originally, because from an investor perspective, many investors are still very serious about your ESG credentials and ESG scores. Also, the European Union put out a guidance about 18 months ago saying that as organizations if you didn't take ESG seriously, they would recommend basically to investors that the investors don't invest in you or buy your stock. So make of that what you will. When we have a look at the money basically that we're actually using, we've seen with both Tesla and Dell that you can buy products with Bitcoin, not the US dollar. But as we look at decentralized finance, we have organizations like Nike that let you buy goods with moves. IKEA lets consumers buy products in Dubai with time. So when we actually have a look at the future of money and payments, check out my other videos because this isn't as straightforward as you might think. And then sanctions and corporate blacklists. If you're a supply chain professional, one day everything's rosy. The next day you're suddenly seeing Russian sanctions taking hold. And now you've got to dislocate your entire supply chain or operations from Russia and move them somewhere. So remember, all these are linked, by the way. Corporate blacklists. We're increasingly seeing the blacklisting of corporations, especially by the US government against China, becoming much more of a trade weapon. So what happens if you're buying from a Chinese organization that suddenly ends up on the US blacklist? Organizations like HIK Vision, Huawei, as we saw a little while ago, ZTE, even DJI basically looks like it's getting onto those lists. So what happens basically if you are reliant on organizations that politicians in a completely different continent, for whatever reason, don't like, rightly or wrongly, and now you are left trying to figure out how you replace an integral partner in your supply chain with somebody else, which, as any professional will tell me, is not easy to do. So sanctions and corporate blacklists are increasingly being used and increasingly being weaponized. We then see three economies, so physical, digital, and virtual economies, which mean that the kinds of products that we buy are changing. So we're used to buying physical products. We're used to buying digital products, whether it's software or stuff as a subscription. But increasingly, the virtual economy is coming into play. So for example, over in the US, one of my clients recently bought a virtual reality office on 42nd Street in New York as an NFT. Now, while this sounds like a gimmick, and I think generally it is, how do you audit that? How do you buy it? How do you ship it? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So when we actually have a look at the virtual world generally doesn't have the same amount of rigor, policy development, governance development, auditing procedures as the rest of these economies, the physical and digital economy. So we kind of have this big gap. Virtual asset management, how do we do that? Et cetera, et cetera. So there's lots of sort of different questions when we have a look at the sort of the increasing relevance basically of the virtual economy. When we have a look at environmental trends, climate change is obviously the big one. The number of extreme weather events has increased by 60% over the past sort of 2 decades. The number of multi-billion-dollar weather events has increased by about 90% over the same period. And the amount of extreme weather-related insurance payouts since the year 2000 is now topping $3 trillion. And when we have a look at extreme weather events, for example, in the US as well as Japan, we're now talking in terms of Category 6 hurricanes. So what happens if the semiconductor factory that you buy all of your chips from, aka Nvidia, who buys the vast majority of their GPUs basically from TSMC in Taiwan, what happens basically if that factory that you rely on gets flattened by a hurricane or a tornado, flooded, as we saw with quite a lot of Seagate's factories a number of years ago, which affected HP's supply chain. So climate change is going to increasingly have an impact on your supply chain, depending on the sectors you care about, et cetera, et cetera. Sea level rise, basically we see sea level rising by about 8 millimeters per year, so by 2030, 40, 50. For example, when we have a look at Shanghai again, it's estimated that a third of Shanghai will be underwater. About A half of Louisiana will be underwater. Miami is already starting to suffer floods, basically that used to be once in a generation, but are now pretty much once every other year. So Miami is now seeing 352% more flooding than it used to. So when we have a look at sea level rise, this affects things like the access to fresh water. Now, if you are running smelting facilities, so iron, aluminium, concrete, that kind of stuff, glass, you need water. You need a particular quality of water, so it affects that. But also this displaces over 800 million people in 54 megacities. That's a huge amount of disruption. Are you prepared for that? And then water scarcity, depending on the kind of organization that you are, you either care about water scarcity or you don't. But by the year 2030, the United Nations says that over 129 countries will be under extreme water stress, where extreme water stress is a term that they use to say these countries will have problems growing food. We also have resource scarcity, and we also care increasingly about resource security. And this is across the board on a number of things. So if we look at Volkswagen, for example, Volkswagen forward ordered $48 billion worth of lithium to secure the lithium that they need for their lithium-ion batteries in their future electric vehicles. Apple did the same thing. When we have a look at rare earths basically became a trade weapon that China was using against the US because the vast majority of high-tech products like semiconductors, etc., rely on rare earth metals. So we're also seeing gas shortages. We've seen that in Europe, especially in Germany, and so on and so forth. So when we have a look at resource scarcity, increasingly there are lots of moves taking place to try to minimize the impact of resource scarcity on different companies' operations. But then when we have a look at resource security, there are also organizations that are paying top dollar to secure the future resources, minerals, rare earths, whatever it happens to be, that they need to keep their supply chains running. Then, from an environmental perspective, net negative. When we have a look at Europe, increasingly it is still cheaper to pollute than to actually protect. But Europe is increasingly thinking about increasing the cost of CO2 emissions per tonne from about 80 euros per tonne to 110 euros per tonne, which then means that if you are a polluter, it suddenly becomes cheaper to invest in the technologies that don't harm the planet than to keep polluting. But again, when we have a look at organizations like DP World and low carbon supply chains and low carbon logistics, these trends have a big impact on global shipping, for example. So the International Maritime Organization wants global shipping to be decarbonized by 2050, but they think it'll really be 2070. But to decarbonize the entire global shipping fleet will cost about $365 billion just in new ships. Now, in terms of transforming legacy ships, where we, for example, see Maersk spending $25 million to convert a traditional bunker fuel-based cargo ship to an LNG fuel source. And these are kind of 20,000 TEU cargo ships. The cost of greening the global cargo ship fleet is significant. Just greening what we have is about 130 billion, and then we obviously need an extra 300 plus billion of new ships. But when we have a look at cargo ships, the average lifespan of a cargo ship now is about 26 years. It's increased, which means that if the IMO wants shipping to be decarbonized and hit its net zero targets by 2050, these big shipping companies need to be buying new fleets now. And then when we have a look at DP World are increasingly routing supply chains and their logistics strategy via barge networks. So there's lots and lots of different things at play here. We could discuss that for ages. And then when we have a look at political trends, we're moving to a bipolar world. Now, this changes everything. This is one of the biggest trends that impacts the future of supply chains, because as you see two large world powers trying to wrestle for dominance, inevitably they're like two 400-pound gorillas basically going at it in a zoo, trying to knock 6 bells out of each other. And ultimately, this means basically that we are seeing cultural shifts, economic shifts. We're seeing the US dollar trying to be undermined as the global reserve currency, which means you end up making more multi-currency transactions than you would normally expect to. We're seeing military dominance basically starting to be ramped up, social upheaval, and so on and so forth. But then we're also seeing a quest for technological dominance. So China, when we actually have a look at China especially, they're investing that $1.4 trillion in emerging technologies, don't forget. When we have a look at that, China knows that in order to own and benefit from future emerging technologies, then it's not just enough to develop those technologies like 5G or 6G. You really need to get the most out of them. You need to own the technology standards, which means that we are seeing a bifurcation in technology standards where, for example, Chinese 5G will not necessarily work as well as it should with European 5G networks and everything else. Now, while we see these gorillas going at each other and we see Europe sort of trying to figure out what its position on all of this is, from a company perspective, this increases the cost of your doing business. So have you factored that into your equations? Probably not. Now, as I travel around the world, I get to speak to lots of different governments, lots of different companies. And this is sort of one of the trends that I've sort of been seeing emerge over the past 6 months. As we continue to see resource scarcity, I've heard more and more governments saying, well, in the event that food becomes scarce, energy becomes scarce, rare earths become scarce, lithium, cobalt becomes scarce, etc., etc., then as a rich country, we can just pay more. Now, that puts the poorer countries at a distinct disadvantage. It's not a conversation I ever like hearing, but nevertheless, it's one I am hearing. So are you prepared for that? And then when we have a look at trade wars, inevitably we all know basically that, for example, if Donald Trump gets into the White House again in 2024, it's likely that there will be some form of trade war shenanigan, which affects your supply chains. And then we're also seeing the weaponization of trade with tariffs and everything else. And remember, all of this is related to everything else. So this is all complicated and just getting even more complicated to try to figure out how you navigate all of these different things, most of which are completely outside of your control. So we're seeing the rise of protectionism. We're seeing the rise of supply chain insecurity and volatility and everything else. And then finally, when we start having a look at societal trends, we have activism. Around 50 to 70% of people in younger generations believe that capitalism just simply isn't working for them because it's responsible for treating workers like commodity and the planet like a commodity. So this swings back round to that ESG conversation that we're actually having. But their behaviours change. In Paris, we saw riots. As we start seeing the wealth gaps increase, as we see real wages deflating rather than inflating, increasingly we see more and more protests around the world. These disrupt supply chains because people strike. We saw that with Foxconn a little while ago, basically, where they were trying to force new wage conditions on people and the workers just downed tools. The Foxconn factories, the giant Foxconn factories, ground to a halt. But we also see a lot more people who are aligning with companies with purposes and values and core beliefs that align with their own. And this is actually an opportunity for brands. When we look at epidemics and pandemics, during the recent COVID-19 pandemic, we saw global PMI fall to its lowest ever rate of 26.5. We saw global economic output fall by about $8.3 trillion. And we saw global GDP contract by about 3%. Now, researchers over the past sort of year or so have been looking at past epidemics and pandemics and trying to figure out, are they more or less likely in the future? And we'll have to see if they're right about this. But generally, most academics are coming to the conclusion that we are likely to see 3 times the number of epidemics, particularly, and pandemics over the next 2 to 3 decades than we have in the past. So again, are your supply chains resilient enough to weather future epidemics? Bearing in mind that epidemics especially are both animal and human. So if you're in the food industry, we're seeing avian flu, we're seeing swine flu disrupting supply chains, and so on and so forth. The rise of the gig economy, 34% of millennials typically work in the gig economy, increasingly. However, we also see fractional work, where more people are likely to actually not have one job, but 1, 2, or 3 jobs. So when we have a look at the impact of that on technology sourcing, I could be a software developer in the morning and I could be a Deliveroo driver in the afternoon. So when we're looking at trying to procure professional services, we've got the giant organizations that we can buy professional services from, of course. But there's also this growing gig economy and fractional workforce that are probably a little bit too good not to be engaged with. And then everyone increasingly wants all of their goods to be on demand and personalized. So when we start having a look at what do we do with all of this, this is where we end up with a couple of conundrums. So in the future, your supply chains need to be agile, because if we see different shocks or different changes occurring, you need to be able to react or even predict them as quickly as you can. So this is really a digital play. Your supply chains from top to bottom need to be digital, because you can spot threats easier and then you can react to threats faster. You also need to be resilient. So being agile and resilient is like an oxymoron, because being resilient means that you often form very strategic partnerships with your top suppliers. And that's kind of fixed. It doesn't fit into that agile model, being able to flip between suppliers quickly, etc., etc. But this is where we look at local sourcing and multi-sourcing, but also flattening the supply chains. You need to explore more, because when we start thinking about what the future of supply chains look like and the future of our procurement systems look like, there's a lot going on. You need to flatten the supply chains, as I discussed, but then you also need to run and model scenarios. Because what happens if any of these things, basically, that I've talked about happens? What is the impact, the business impact to your organization? How much is it going to cost you in lost productivity, lost business, etc., etc., etc.? But again, if you have a digitized supply chain, if you have artificial intelligence baked into your businesses, then typically you can run scenarios and model scenarios, all kinds of scenarios, much faster than you ever did before. And once you've run these scenarios, you need to translate those into actionable strategy. And we have a way to do that quite easily. And that's it from me. So I hope you enjoyed the presentation. The only thing that we covered was everything. And as for me, I'm going to go and buy some stuff now. So take care, and I'll speak to you all soon. Ta-da, bye-bye.